the silence that terrifies. What if the silence of God is not absence but strategy? You prayed with sincerity. You asked with faith. You held on when everything inside you wanted to let go. And yet nothing changed. The doors remained closed. The answers did not come. The situation did not move. And now, there is a weight inside your chest that is difficult to explain, because it is not just pain. It is confusion. Where is God when everything is going wrong? This question does not come from rebellion. It comes from exhaustion. It comes from someone who believed, who trusted, who expected something to happen, and is now facing a reality that feels completely disconnected from what they were told about faith. And this is where the real struggle begins, not outside, but inside your mind. Because the greatest battle is not the problem you are facing. It is the interpretation you give to the silence you are experiencing. The human mind was conditioned to expect responses, movement, signs, confirmation. When none of that appears, something subtle begins to shift. Doubt does not enter like a storm. It enters like a whisper. Maybe God is not listening. Maybe this is not going to change. Maybe you are on your own. And without realizing it, your perception starts to distort your faith. Not because you stopped believing completely, but because you started questioning quietly. And those quiet questions, if not confronted, grow into internal fractures that weaken your ability to stand firm. Charles Spurgeon taught with clarity that God's silence is never empty. It is intentional. It is precise. It is often the very environment where the deepest transformation takes place. But here is the part that most people are not prepared to accept. God does not operate according to your emotional urgency. He operates according to a purpose that is shaping something far greater than your current relief. And this creates tension, a tension between what you feel and what you are called to believe. Because everything in you is asking for an immediate answer, while everything in the process is demanding endurance. This is why waiting on God is not passive. It is one of the most psychologically demanding states a person can experience. You are required to remain steady in a reality that gives you no visible reason to stay steady. You begin to question your own steps. Was that decision right? Did you misunderstand something? Did you miss a sign? And the more you try to find clarity using your own logic, the more lost you feel. This is where many people start to break internally. Not because God left them, but because they no longer know how to interpret what is happening. They mistake silence for absence. They confuse delay with rejection. They allow emotion to rewrite what faith once established. But listen carefully. The silence of God is not neglect. It is not indifference. It is not punishment. It is positioning. There are things that cannot be built in noise. There are strengths that cannot be developed in comfort. There is a level of faith that cannot exist without uncertainty. And that is exactly why the silence feels so heavy. Because it is removing everything that you used to depend on, so that what remains is no longer fragile. This is the moment where your faith stops being based on what you see and starts being anchored in what you choose to believe without evidence. It is no longer about feeling supported. It is about deciding to stand even when you feel nothing. And this is where the real confrontation takes place. You are no longer dealing with external circumstances. You are dealing with your own perception, your own expectations, your own internal resistance to the process. Because deep down, what disturbs you is not just the silence. It is the lack of control. You cannot force an answer. You cannot accelerate the process. You cannot predict what is coming next. And for a mind that was trained to control outcomes, this is terrifying. But what if everything that feels like nothing is actually something being built in a dimension you cannot yet see? What if the silence is not delaying your life, but preparing you for a level where what you receive will no longer destroy you? Because here is the truth that separates those who endure from those who collapse. The silence is not the end of God's movement. It is the part of the process where He is working without your interference. And if you do not understand this, you will abandon the process at the exact moment where everything is being aligned. And that leads to something even more dangerous than pain. The invisible mistake that destroys faith before the breakthrough ever has a chance to appear. Now pay attention, because what comes next is where most people lose everything without even realizing it. The invisible mistake that destroys faith. There is a mistake so subtle, so silent, that most people never realize it is happening until their faith is already weakened. It does not come through rebellion. It does not come through open disbelief. It comes disguised as logic. You start trying to make sense of God through your own timeline. At first it seems reasonable. You prayed, so you expect a response. You waited, so you expect movement. You believed, so you expect results. But when none of that happens in the time you anticipated, your mind begins to reinterpret the situation. Not with anger, but with quiet conclusions. Maybe this is not for me. Maybe God is not going to act. Maybe this situation is just the way it is. And this is where the mistake begins. You are no longer waiting on God. You are adjusting your expectations to match your disappointment. This is dangerous because it feels like maturity. It feels like acceptance. But in reality, it is the slow abandonment of faith. The human mind seeks resolution. It cannot remain in uncertainty for too long without trying to create its own answers. And when God remains silent, the mind fills that silence with its own interpretations. That is why so many people do not lose faith suddenly. They lose it gradually, through small internal agreements with doubt. They stop expecting. They stop believing with intensity. They begin to lower their vision, not because they were instructed to, but because they became tired of waiting. And here is the confrontation you need to face. Delay is not denial. Time is not rejection. Silence is not absence. But when you interpret it that way, you begin to act differently. You pray less. You trust less. You prepare less. And without realizing it, your actions start to align with disbelief, even if your words still claim faith. This is exactly what Charles Spurgeon warned about in his teachings. Faith is not proven in moments of clarity. It is revealed in moments where nothing makes sense, and yet you refuse to change your position. Because true faith does not adjust itself based on circumstances. It remains anchored, even when everything around it is unstable. But most people do the opposite. They allow circumstances to redefine their faith, and this creates a silent fracture inside them. They are still present, still believing in theory, but internally something has shifted. The conviction is no longer as strong. The expectation is no longer as alive. They are no longer waiting with faith. They are waiting with doubt. And that is why the mistake is so dangerous. Because from the outside, nothing seems different. But inside, everything has changed. You start to move as if nothing is coming. You start to live as if the answer will never arrive. And when that happens, you disconnect yourself from the very posture that sustains faith during the process. But listen carefully. Waiting on God is not about adjusting your expectations to your reality. It is about refusing to let your reality redefine what you believe. This requires discipline, not emotional discipline alone, but mental discipline. The ability to reject thoughts that contradict what you know to be true, even when those thoughts feel convincing. Because the mind will always try to protect you from disappointment. It will suggest that you expect less, believe less, and prepare less, so that you suffer less. But faith does not operate that way. Faith requires you to remain open, expectant, and aligned, even when there is no visible evidence to support it. And this is where most people fail. They think they are being realistic, when in fact they are slowly surrendering their belief. They think they are protecting themselves when in fact they are disconnecting from the process. And without realizing it, they step out of alignment before the answer even has a chance to manifest. Now understand this. If the silence tests your patience, this mistake tests your perception. And if your perception is compromised, everything that comes next will be misinterpreted, which leads to a deeper question that most people are afraid to confront. Why does God remain silent exactly when you feel like you need Him the most? Why God does not act when you need Him most? There is a moment in every person's life when the need becomes urgent, when the pressure becomes unbearable, and when the expectation reaches its highest point. You pray with intensity, you focus your faith, you align your thoughts, and deep inside you believe that this is the moment when God must act. And yet nothing happens. This is where the deepest confusion begins, because everything in your logic tells you that this would be the exact moment for a divine intervention. You are not asking casually. You are not distracted. You are fully present, fully aware, and fully dependent. And still, there is silence. To the untrained mind, this feels like contradiction. If God is present, why does he not respond when the need is greatest? But this question reveals something critical. It exposes how the human mind understands help. You associate help with immediate relief. You define intervention as the removal of discomfort. You believe that if God is with you, then the situation should change as soon as your need intensifies. But God does not operate within that definition. God is not focused on relieving the moment. He is focused on transforming the person who is living through the moment. And this changes everything, because if the goal is transformation, then immediate relief becomes a limitation. If every time you felt pressure, the pressure was removed, you would never develop resistance. If every time you felt uncertainty, clarity was given instantly, you would never develop trust. This is why what feels like inaction is often intentional restraint. God is not absent. He is allowing the process to reach a level where something deeper can be formed inside you. James chapter 1 verses 2 through 3 teaches that the testing of faith produces perseverance, not comfort, not immediate answers, perseverance. And perseverance is not built in moments of ease. It is built in moments where you are required to continue without visible support. This is where faith separates from emotion. Emotion demands evidence. Emotion needs to feel secure in order to remain stable. But faith operates in a different dimension. It does not wait for confirmation. It moves based on conviction. And conviction is only proven when it is challenged. That is why the moment you feel like you need God the most is often the moment where the process becomes silent. Not because you are being ignored, but because you are being elevated to a level where your faith is no longer dependent on external validation. Charles Spurgeon understood this with clarity. He taught that God's delays are not denials, but designs. Designs that shape the inner structure of a person in ways that visible answers never could. Because answers solve situations. But silence builds identity. And identity determines how you will handle not just this moment, but everything that comes after it. If you receive the answer without the transformation, you will not be able to sustain what you receive. You will collapse under the weight of what you once prayed for. So God, in his precision, does not rush to give you what you want. He works to prepare you for what you are asking. And preparation is not always comfortable. It often feels like abandonment, because it removes the immediate sense of control and replaces it with uncertainty. This is why the process feels so intense. You are being asked to remain stable in a moment that offers you no visible stability. You are being asked to trust without proof, to stand without support, to continue without clarity. And this is where most people begin to withdraw, not physically but internally. They stop expecting, they stop engaging, they stop believing with the same intensity, and without realizing it, they disconnect from the very process that was shaping them. But understand this, the silence is not a rejection of your need. It is a response to your potential. God sees beyond the urgency of your situation. He sees what you are becoming through it. And if he answered you too soon, you would remain at a level that is not capable of sustaining what is coming. This is why the silence remains exactly when the need feels greatest, because that is the point where transformation becomes possible. And if you can endure this moment without altering your faith, without adjusting your belief, without retreating internally, you will cross a threshold that very few people ever reach. But to do that, you need to understand something that most were never taught. The waiting is not empty. There is a process happening that you cannot see. And once you understand this, your perception of the entire situation will begin to change. The hidden process. No one ever taught you. What if the waiting you are experiencing is not a pause, but a construction? You look at your situation and see stillness. No movement, no visible change. Everything seems frozen, as if time itself decided to stop exactly when you needed it to move. But what if that perception is incomplete? Because there are processes that do not reveal themselves externally. There are transformations that occur in silence beneath the surface, where your eyes cannot reach but your character is being shaped with precision. This is where most people misunderstand waiting. They treat it as inactivity, as wasted time, as a gap between what was and what should be. But waiting, in the spiritual sense, is not empty. It is structured. It is intentional. It is active in ways that cannot be measured by visible results. While nothing appears to be changing around you, something is being adjusted within you. Your reactions are being tested. Your emotional stability is being stretched. Your ability to remain grounded without reassurance is being developed. And this process is not random. It follows a design that prioritizes strength over speed. Because speed can give you something quickly, but it cannot prepare you to sustain it. This is why the process is hidden. If you could see everything that is being aligned, you would not struggle with trust. If you could understand every detail of what is happening, you would not experience uncertainty. But then, faith would not be required. And without faith, transformation would be superficial. This is why God allows the process to remain unseen. Not to confuse you, but to train you. To develop a type of stability that does not depend on what you can observe, but on what you choose to believe, even when observation fails. This is deeply connected to what is written in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 18, where it is taught that what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. This is not just a spiritual statement. It is a principle of perception. It is a shift in how you interpret reality, because what you see right now is only a fraction of what is actually happening. There are alignments taking place that you cannot detect. There are obstacles being removed that you do not even know existed. There are internal limitations being confronted, broken, and rebuilt into something stronger. And all of this happens in silence. This is why the waiting feels so intense. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening in a dimension that your senses cannot access. And this creates discomfort, because the human mind seeks evidence. It wants to confirm progress. It wants to measure movement. It wants to validate effort through results. When none of that is available, it begins to question the entire process. But here is the confrontation you need to accept. Your inability to see does not mean the process is not real. It means you are being trained to operate beyond what you can see. This is where the depth of faith is developed. Not in moments where everything is clear, but in moments where clarity is absent and you still choose alignment. Charles Spurgeon emphasized that God often works most powerfully in ways that are invisible to human perception, not because he is distant, but because he is precise. He is dealing with layers that cannot be addressed through surface-level intervention, because what needs to be transformed is not just your situation, it is you. And this is where the waiting becomes meaningful. You are not being delayed, you are being refined. Every moment of silence is removing something unnecessary, strengthening something essential, and preparing you for a level where what you receive will no longer overwhelm you. But to benefit from this process, you must remain aligned with it. And that requires something that most people are not willing to confront. Because at this level, the waiting stops being about time. It becomes about identity. The test that reveals who you really are. There comes a point in the waiting where the situation itself is no longer the main issue. The pain is still there. The uncertainty is still present. But something deeper begins to surface. You. Because when everything external is stripped away, when answers are absent and control is removed, you are left face to face with your true position. Not the version of you that speaks with confidence when things are going well. Not the version of you that feels strong when there is visible progress. But the version of you that remains when there is no reward, no confirmation, no immediate result. This is where identity is exposed, and this is what makes the waiting so intense. It is not just testing your patience. It is confronting your motives. Why are you still here? Why are you still believing? Why are you still waiting? These questions do not come to discourage you. They come to reveal you. Because as long as things are working, it is easy to maintain faith. As long as there is movement, it is easy to stay committed. But when everything slows down, when everything becomes silent, your reason for staying begins to matter more than your ability to endure. This is the moment where a silent decision is made. Do you serve God for what He does or for who He is? This is not a question that can be answered with words. It is answered with posture. If your faith depends on results, then your faith will fluctuate with circumstances. When things improve, your faith strengthens. When things decline, your faith weakens. And without realizing it, your belief becomes conditional. But if your faith is anchored in who God is, independent of what you see, then your position becomes stable. And stability is what allows you to endure. This is why the waiting reveals identity. It removes everything that could hide your true foundation. It exposes whether your connection is transactional or transformational. A transactional faith says, "I believe because I expect something in return." A transformational faith says, "I believe because I know who I am connected to, regardless of what happens next." This distinction changes everything. Because once your faith becomes independent of immediate outcomes, you are no longer controlled by what you feel. You are no longer shaken by what you see. You begin to operate from a deeper level of conviction, and that conviction becomes your strength. This is what is reflected in the book of Job, chapter 13, verse 15. When it is declared that even if everything is taken away, the position of trust remains unchanged. This is not emotional strength. This is identity, and identity cannot be built without confrontation. This is why the process feels so personal. It is not just about what you are going through. It is about what is being revealed through what you are going through. Every delay, every unanswered moment, every stretch of silence is forcing you to define your position without external influence. And this is where many people retreat, because it is easier to believe when there is evidence. It is easier to trust when there is confirmation. But when those elements are removed, belief requires something deeper. It requires decision. A decision to remain, even when leaving would feel more comfortable. A decision to trust, even when doubt feels more logical. A decision to stand, even when everything around you suggests that you should step back. This is the test. And it is not designed to break you. It is designed to clarify you. Because once you understand why you are still standing, your foundation becomes unshakable. And when your foundation is unshakable, the process no longer controls you. You begin to move through it with awareness. You begin to see beyond it with clarity. But to reach that level, you must pass through something that most people avoid. The part of the process where the silence itself becomes the tool. The power of silence that most people cannot endure. There is a dimension of the process that few are willing to face because it does not offer comfort, it does not offer reassurance, and it does not offer explanation. It offers silence. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that forces you to confront everything you have been avoiding. The kind that removes distractions, removes noise, removes external validation, and leaves you alone with your own thoughts. This is where the process intensifies. Because as long as there is noise, you can escape. You can distract yourself. You can fill the space. You can avoid deeper confrontation. But when silence takes over, there is nowhere to hide. And this is not accidental. Silence is a tool. It is used to strip away everything that is not essential, everything that is unstable, everything that you were unconsciously depending on. It exposes attachments, insecurities, fears, and expectations that were hidden beneath activity. And once they are exposed, they cannot be ignored. This is why most people do not endure this stage. They mistake silence for emptiness. They interpret it as abandonment. They try to escape it by lowering their expectations, by disconnecting emotionally, by stepping away from the process entirely. But what they do not realize is that the silence is doing something that noise never could. It is restructuring their internal foundation. Because a faith that depends on constant reinforcement is fragile. A faith that requires continuous confirmation cannot sustain pressure. It collapses the moment external support is removed. Silence removes that dependency. It forces you to stand without reinforcement. It forces you to remain without feedback. It forces you to continue without clarity. And in doing so, it builds something that cannot be easily shaken. This is where faith stops being emotional and becomes structural. It is no longer about how you feel, it is about who you have decided to be. 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 13 teaches that even when human consistency fails, the nature of God remains unchanged. This is critical, because it shifts the focus from your instability to His stability. And when your faith is anchored in something that does not change, you no longer need constant signs to remain steady. But reaching this level requires endurance, because silence amplifies internal voices. Doubt becomes louder, fear becomes more convincing. Logic begins to present arguments that seem reasonable, suggesting that maybe it is time to let go, to move on, to stop expecting. And this is where discipline becomes essential. Not external discipline, but internal discipline. The ability to observe your thoughts without submitting to them. The ability to reject conclusions that contradict what you have already chosen to believe. The ability to remain aligned even when your mind is trying to pull you in a different direction. This is not easy, because the mind is designed to protect you from uncertainty. It wants closure. It wants resolution. It wants to eliminate discomfort as quickly as possible. But growth does not happen in resolution. It happens in tension. And silence sustains that tension long enough for something real to be built. This is why the process feels so demanding. You are being trained to exist without immediate answers, to move without visible direction, to trust without confirmation. And while this feels like deprivation, it is actually preparation. Preparation for a level where your stability is no longer dependent on circumstances, where your faith is no longer influenced by outcomes, where your identity is no longer fragile. But to access that level, you must endure what most people cannot endure. The silence that removes everything except what is true. And once you reach that point, something begins to change. Not around you at first, within you. And that internal shift is what makes it possible for you to face the next stage. Because once silence has done its work, the question is no longer whether you can endure. The question becomes whether you know how to remain. How not to give up when everything collapses. There is a point in the process where everything seems to fall apart at once, not gradually, not in small pieces, but all at the same time. What you expected to hold you up begins to fail. What you believed would remain stable starts to shift, and suddenly, you are not just dealing with silence anymore. You are dealing with collapse. This is where endurance alone is not enough. Because enduring without direction leads to exhaustion, and exhaustion, if not managed, leads to surrender. Not because you want to give up, but because you no longer know how to keep going. This is where most people misunderstand what it means to remain. They think it is about forcing themselves to stay strong, suppressing emotion, pretending that everything is fine. But that is not stability. That is resistance without structure. True stability is built differently. It begins with how you manage your internal state. Because when everything outside is unstable, your internal environment becomes your only place of control. If your thoughts are chaotic, your emotions will follow. If your emotions are unstable, your actions will weaken. And if your actions weaken, your alignment with the process begins to break. This is why the first thing you must learn is control of thought. Not by eliminating thoughts, but by refusing to accept every thought as truth. Your mind will produce interpretations based on fear, based on past experiences, based on the need to protect you from further disappointment. It will suggest that things are not going to change, that you should lower your expectations, that continuing is no longer worth it. And if you accept those thoughts without question, they will shape your behavior. This is why discipline at this stage is mental before it is physical. You must decide which thoughts are allowed to stay. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 5 teaches the importance of bringing every thought into alignment. This is not a passive act, it is intentional. It requires awareness, it requires strength, because not every thought deserves your agreement. Once your thoughts are managed, your emotions begin to stabilize. Not because the situation changed, but because your interpretation changed. And when your emotions stabilize, your actions become consistent. You continue to pray, even when you feel nothing. You continue to move, even when you see nothing. You continue to prepare even when nothing around you suggests that preparation is necessary. This is what separates those who collapse from those who endure. Consistency without emotional dependence. You are no longer acting based on how you feel. You are acting based on what you have decided. And this creates a new level of strength, because now your position is not influenced by external fluctuation. It is anchored internally. But there is another element that most people ignore. You must protect your focus, because in moments of collapse, distractions become more attractive. Escapes become more tempting. Anything that can reduce the pressure becomes appealing. But every distraction weakens your alignment. Every escape delays your development. This is why you must become selective. Selective with what you consume. Selective with what you think about. Selective with what you allow to influence your perception. Because your environment, even at the level of thought, shapes your ability to remain. And remaining is the objective. Not forcing outcomes, not controlling timing, remaining aligned. Because when you remain, something begins to shift. Not immediately in your situation, but in your capacity. You become less reactive. You become more aware. You become more stable. And that stability allows you to pass through the collapse without losing your position. This is what most people fail to understand. The goal is not to avoid collapse. The goal is to remain intact through it. Because if you can do that, you reach a point where something unexpected begins to happen. The same situation that once confused you starts to reveal meaning. The same silence that once disturbed you starts to make sense. And that is the moment where everything begins to change. The moment when everything starts to make sense. There is a moment in the process that cannot be forced, cannot be predicted, and cannot be rushed. It does not arrive because you demanded it. It arrives because you endured long enough to reach it. At first, nothing seems different. Your situation may still look the same. The external conditions may not have shifted in the way you expected, but something inside you is no longer the same. And this is where the transition begins, because clarity does not always come through changed circumstances. It often comes through a changed perception. What once felt like confusion begins to organize itself. What once felt like delay begins to reveal intention. You start to see patterns where before you only saw problems. You begin to understand that certain things had to fall apart, certain doors had to remain closed, certain answers had to be withheld. Not to harm you, but to position you. This is the moment where your perspective expands beyond the urgency that once controlled you. You no longer ask, "Why is this happening to me?" You begin to ask, "What is this forming in me?" And that shift changes everything. Because now, you are no longer resisting the process. You are participating in it. This is where the teachings of Charles Spurgeon gain a deeper meaning. He emphasized that God's ways are not immediately understood, but they are always precise. And precision often requires time, silence, and alignment before it becomes visible. Now you begin to recognize something that you could not see before. The things that did not happen protected you. The delays that frustrated you strengthened you. The silence that disturbed you refined you. And without those elements, you would not be able to stand where you are now. This realization does not remove the memory of the struggle, but it transforms its meaning. What once felt like wasted time now feels like necessary preparation. What once felt like abandonment now feels like hidden guidance. What once felt like confusion now feels like alignment that you could not have orchestrated on your own. This is why this moment is so powerful. Because it does not depend on external validation. It is internal confirmation. A clarity that settles within you, not because someone explained it, but because you lived through it. And once you reach this level, your relationship with the process changes permanently. You no longer panic in silence. You no longer rush in uncertainty. You no longer collapse under delay. Because you have seen what happens when you remain. You have experienced the transformation that occurs when you do not abandon your position. And this creates a new kind of confidence. Not the confidence that comes from knowing what will happen next, but the confidence that comes from knowing that whatever happens next, you are prepared for it. This is where peace begins to replace tension. Not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer dependent on immediate resolution. You have developed the capacity to exist in the unknown without losing your stability. And that capacity changes how you move forward. But even in this moment of clarity, there is a truth that must be established. Because understanding the process is powerful, but there is a principle that defines everything you have just experienced. A truth so simple, yet so difficult to accept when you are in the middle of the struggle. And once you fully understand it, your entire perception of waiting on God will be transformed. The truth that changes everything. There is a truth that most people only understand after they have suffered long enough, waited long enough, and questioned everything they once believed. God is not late. He is working in dimensions you cannot see. This is not a phrase meant to comfort you. It is a principle that redefines how you interpret everything that happens in your life. Because the moment you assume that God is late, you place him inside your timeline. You reduce the infinite to something measurable. You try to evaluate divine precision through human urgency, and that is where distortion begins. You start to believe that if something has not happened yet, it should have. You begin to feel that something is wrong, that something is delayed, that something is missing. But nothing is missing. What is happening is simply beyond your current perception. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 11 teaches that everything is made appropriate in its time, even when the full understanding of that timing is not given to the human mind. This means that there is a level of orchestration taking place that you are not designed to fully comprehend in the moment. And this is where trust becomes essential. Not blind trust, but informed trust. Trust based on the recognition that your perspective is limited, but the process is not. Because while you are focused on what you can see, God is working on what you cannot. He is aligning people you have not met. He is removing obstacles you do not know exist. He is restructuring circumstances that are not yet visible. And at the same time, he is working within you, adjusting your mindset, strengthening your emotional resilience, expanding your capacity to handle what you once asked for, because receiving without preparation leads to loss, and God does not prepare outcomes before he prepares the person. This is why what feels like delay is actually synchronization. Everything is being positioned to meet you at the exact level where you will be able to sustain it. Not before, never before. Because if it came too soon, it would destroy you. And this is difficult to accept because the human mind is driven by immediacy. You want relief now. You want clarity now. You want movement now. But the process is not designed to satisfy urgency. It is designed to establish permanence. This is why those who understand this truth move differently. They do not panic in silence. They do not interpret delay as failure. They do not allow emotion to dictate their perception. Because they know something that most people ignore. The absence of visible movement does not mean the absence of divine activity. And once this truth is internalized, everything changes. Your waiting becomes intentional. Your posture becomes stable. Your faith becomes independent of outcomes. You no longer need constant reassurance because you understand that what is happening goes beyond what you can measure. And this creates a level of peace that cannot be shaken by external conditions. Not because everything is perfect, but because your perception is aligned with something greater than the moment you are in. This is the shift. From urgency to understanding. From confusion to clarity. From emotional dependence to structural faith. And once you reach this level, there is only one thing left to define. Not what God is doing, but what you will do next. The decision that defines your destiny. Now everything comes down to one point. Not your situation, not your past, not even what you are currently facing. It comes down to your decision. Because after everything you have seen, everything you have endured, everything you have begun to understand, you are no longer in the same position you were at the beginning. You are not the same person who questioned in confusion. You are not the same person who interpreted silence as absence. Now you know. You know that silence carries purpose. You know that delay carries precision. You know that what feels like nothing is often the most critical part of the process. And with that knowledge comes responsibility, because now you cannot go back to the same patterns of thought. You cannot interpret your reality with the same limitations. You cannot allow doubt to take the same space it once occupied. Now, you must choose. Will you abandon the process when it becomes uncomfortable? Or will you remain when everything in you is being challenged? This is the decision that defines everything, because your destiny is not determined by what happens to you. It is determined by how you position yourself in what happens to you. Most people wait until they feel strong to continue, but those who reach a different level decide to continue even when they feel nothing. This is what separates those who break from those who are built. You now understand that waiting on God is not passive. It is active alignment. It is the conscious decision to remain steady in a moment that offers no visible support. It is the refusal to let temporary conditions redefine eternal truth. This is what transforms you, because when you choose to remain, something irreversible begins to take place inside you. You become less dependent on outcomes. You become less influenced by external pressure. You become anchored in something deeper than emotion, something more stable than circumstance. And from that position, your life begins to change. Not because everything suddenly becomes easy, but because you are no longer fragile. You are no longer reacting. You are no longer interpreting every moment through fear. You are standing. And once you learn how to stand, truly stand, without needing constant confirmation, without needing immediate results, without needing visible proof, you enter a level where your faith becomes unshakable. This is the result of enduring the silence. This is the result of refusing to abandon the process. This is the result of choosing alignment over comfort. So now the question is no longer where God is. The question is where you stand. Because in the end, the silence was never meant to push you away. It was meant to reveal who you are willing to become.